On May 4, 2000, an airplane with 69 passengers and 8 crew members crashed in densely populated residential area of Nigeria. This plane was EAS Airlines Flight 40-26, which was a scheduled domestic flight between Kano and Lagos, both in Nigeria. The plane involved in crash was BAC Make 115525FT. This crash results in 103 deaths including 30 casualties at ground. The commander of the flight was 49-year-old Captain Peter Abayomi, with a flight hours of more than 14,000 hours, of which 7,000 hours were on the type. He joined EAS Airlines in 2000 and had been flying the BAC 111 ever since. The co-pilot was 47-year-old First Officer Chris Aduoladegboy. He had accrued a total of more than 8,000 flight hours, of which 3,350 hours were on the type. The flight engineers on board were Emmanuel Idoko and Muhammad Saki. At 12:19 hours, crew gets the clearance and began to taxi for their journey, and at 12:26 hours, plane was lined up for takeoff. During roll, controller at tower noticed sluggish speed of the aircraft which was not usual and pace was much slower. And when it passed the runway threshold, the nose was in upward position and the landing gear was still in contact with ground. This culminates into overrunning the runway. This overrunning causes a burst of cloud that was seen from control tower. After swerving, eventually aircraft lift off. But before it could fully lift off the ground, the landing gears struck a ground depression, causing a violent impact that rattled the entire aircraft. Even though the aircraft had successfully taken off from the runway, its airspeed began to drop, and the crew was faced with an impending stall condition. Captain Peter reported to the control tower that he was having an engine failure, and they tried to avoid stalling the aircraft and decided to lower the nose, but their altitude was too low with houses could be seen from the cabin, just mere meters from the aircraft. Passengers inside the aircraft were panicking and screaming. People on the ground, who witnessed the aircraft coming towards them, then scrambled to safety. The aircraft could not gain more altitude and failed to avoid obstacles. It then clipped a minaret of a mosque and then struck numerous houses and a local Islamic school on the ground. The aircraft then flew onto another mosque at full force and burst into flames. Praying services were held at the local mosques, and at least 100 students were in the school complex at the time of the crash. Many buildings collapsed, including the school and mosque. Immediate after crash, Nigerian government constituted a committee to investigate the cause of crash. The most important question was, why aircraft overrun? And with regards to this, many theories were given, but eventually it was found that there was no technical defects on the aircraft, meaning that it was airworthy to fly. All the parameters were under safety limits. Now the hopes were on flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. Unfortunately, there were no usable flight recorders. The cockpit voice recorder was missing from the crash site. However, investigators did manage to recover the flight data recorder. The readout indicated that none of the recordings were from flights in Nigeria. The flight data recorder had never been maintained by EAS Airlines, and thus it recorded flights that had been carried out during its operation with previous airliners in Europe. The investigation was effectively hampered by the lack of data from the flight recorders. According to investigators, the most plausible hypothesis was due to the lackadaisical attitude of the pilots during the takeoff roll. This was the first time for both flight crew members to fly to Kano. Apparently, both flight crews had been conditioned with the takeoffs on their previous flights, which took place in airports with longer runways. During the takeoff roll, the crew didn't take the shorter runway length into account. The crew was probably busy checking the engine parameters and aircraft instruments until they shifted their attention to the runway outside, which was already too late due to the length. The takeoff roll was slow, as per the testimony of the on-duty air traffic controller at the time. The lack of judgment from both flight crew members caused the aircraft to overrun the runway. Even though the hypothesis was plausible, Investigators could not confirm whether their hypothesis was actually true due to the lack of data from flight recorders. Therefore, the reasons for the runway overrun could not be determined. In investigation, it was found that engines were located at the back of the aircraft, and several objects were propelled into the engine. This was confirmed by disassembly engine, where dusts had been compacted and compressed within the high-pressure section of the turbine, creating a cake formation that had been lodged between the crevices of the compressor casings. The amount of dusts inside the engines resulted in the momentary degradation of the engine's ability to produce thrust. With the degraded performance of the engine, the aircraft could not gain altitude quickly enough. Eventually, due to the low altitude of the aircraft, the limited ability to gain altitude and the reduced performance of the aircraft's speed, the aircraft couldn't climb safely from the crowded Guamaja quarters. The final report attributed the crash to the crew's inability to safely execute the takeoff phase within the available runway length, accompanied with a breakdown of coordination between each flight crew members caused the aircraft to be unable to gain altitude quickly and safely, ultimately caused the aircraft to crash. The AIPB issued 8 recommendations as a result of the accident, including improvements related to supervision, stricter penalties for malpractices, and improvements related to aircraft flight recorders, in which the NCAA should not register an aircraft under Nigerian registration if an aircraft have not been fitted with a digital flight recorder. The NCAA was also asked to immediately conduct an audit to every BAC 111 in Nigeria to ensure that only operators who have the required spare parts that are allowed to conduct operation within Nigeria, in response to EAS Airlines cannibalized aircraft practice.